Grade 11s, we want to be at a place where we can work on initial resistance, whether it's school or not. So the first thing I want you to do when you're ready for initial resistance is find this note, go and read those pages there. That's your focus and your Oxford textbook. Then gather together all the notes you need, like those notes. And then you start working out your own model essay, how you want to write it. Okay, following these instructions. But I'm going to give you an overview so that the job becomes easier. So if you have a look at this over here, then you'll see that there's a way that we can work it out. Okay, so for initial resistance to a protest, it's an essay for paper 2, and the focus is the 1940s and the 50s. So we don't discuss Sharpeville, we don't discuss the 76 riots, because our focus is the 1940s and 50s. That's why it's called initial. From 1960, when there was an armed struggle, then it becomes a different type of resistance because it is the armed struggle, so it's no longer initial, it is intensified. So from the 60s, they move to intensified resistance. Right, so before you can get to that, you may have to make sure that you are organized in terms of Afrikaner nationalism and apartheid and that you understand that work. Then, we don't know what the line of argument will be, but what we can consider is that maybe it will be something like how successful was initial resistance. Now, we know that apartheid didn't end in 1960, so it wasn't successful in resisting apartheid and in stopping apartheid. However, that's quite negative because remember, resistance might over a long period of time have positive consequences. So another possible question, and there are 2 example questions in your notes, would be, was government so harsh that they managed to stop all forms of resistance? So no, they were very harsh, but there were still forms of resistance. And then was there no resistance? There was some resistance. It was not intense. It was not the armed struggle, but there was. And then another question could be to say, what was the defiance and what was government's response each time? And so I'll show you how you can cover that. Right, so once you've done your other work, you are then ready to prepare this essay. And for your introduction, you would say that the National Party came to power in 1948 with an election campaign based on promoting this idea that the National Party would protect voters from the Swart Gevaar. Then you could mention that they brought out laws, oppression, discrimination, and that the resistance movement focused on passive resistance. Some argued that it was a cap-in-hand resistance. Others said that it was ineffective, but some argued that it was necessary. In 1960s, the armed struggle comes about. So when you introduce it, you might have to define apartheid or resistance depending on the topic. Then you could do a paragraph on background, some laws. So in other words, you could take your knowledge of your source-based question on apartheid and you could talk about just 1 or 2 or 3 of some of the more severe laws that existed and explain the context of why resistance was necessary. Otherwise, you jump into resistance, but you haven't showed what is being resisted. But it would have to be a very short paragraph. After that, so it's either paragraph 2 or 3, depending on whether you've done a background paragraph, you would look at the program of action. So the program of action is by the ANC. It calls for boycotts, strikes, and then the main events are the Freedom of Speech Convention and the May Day strike of 1st of May, 1950. Then you can jump in and you can say what the government's response is. Government responded with the Suppression of Communism Act, whereby the Communist Party was banned. And then you can also say that the program of action led to the formation of a joint planning council. That planning council then starts planning for resistance, which leads us to the Defiance campaign. And there it's on the 26th of June 1952 that it kicks off. But the volunteers had been trained before that date. 8,000 arrests of people who are defying laws. So people would go and purposely sit on a whites-only bench or act against any of the laws that they were trying to show to be petty and ineffective and unfair and discriminatory. There were over 8,000 arrests, and government responded with a Public Safety Act and a Criminal Law Amendment Act. Sorry, just want to a Public Safety Act and a a Public Safety Act and a Criminal Law Amendment Act. And then here's a success. The ANC grows from 7,000 to 100,000 because of the Defiance Campaign. So that tells us that the Defiance Campaign was effective in increasing the ANC's membership and in getting people on board in supporting resistance to apartheid. So that's quite important. Then we can move to the Freedom Charter. It gets its own paragraph, and we talk about Dr. Z.K. Matthews suggesting a document, a policy on what should be how the country would become once apartheid was ended. So this charter gets drawn up in Kliptown on the 26th of June 1955. Famously, some people were under banning orders and couldn't be there with the big group, and they sat on a hill in the distance and watched. And so then from that comes this charter that all people should share in the land, that all people should experience the doors of learning and education being open. So you can give some of those facts, and then you can indicate that the police raided at the end. They took all these names and all this information, and that based on that information, we're going to have the treason trial. Then you can do the treason trials. You can say 156 people were tried for treason. It was argued that they were involved in drawing up the Freedom Charter, and that the Freedom Charter was communist because it said all people should share in the land, all people should share in the land. And so it argued that this indicated that everybody who participated in the Freedom Charter was a communist. We know that you might have agreed with the Freedom Charter but not been a communist. You might have just believed in fair and equal access to land or to the resources of the land, to wealth. Okay, and then you discuss Women's March, 6th of August 1956. You speak about the 20,000 women from the Women's League and from FEDSO. All the races are represented in that march, so women come together regardless of their race, and it's a reaction to pass laws that women are supposed to have passes. You can mention the slogan of "You strike a woman, you strike a rock," and give some facts about that. After that, you can talk about other resistance. Now you go very brief, and you'll say there was a torch commando, it did this, it was that. So just a sentence. You can mention the Pondoland Revolt, one or two sentences about that. You can speak about communities who showed resistance. You can speak about the Alexandra bus boycotts. You can speak about Cato Manor. So you find a few examples of other resistance besides these main ones. And then you can do a paragraph on government responses. So you might have already mentioned the Public Safety Act. You might have already mentioned the treason trials, which is a government response. You might have already mentioned the Suppression of Communism Act. But now you go to wrap it all together, and you say that each time the government was totalitarianist, that they were oppressive, and that they kept introducing new and new laws and bannings of people and arrests because they were not prepared to listen to the resistance movement. They found ways to oppress and suppress and repress even more. So in fact, instead of hearing them out, they became more determined to enforce apartheid. In America, when the resistance movement of Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement highlighted problems, government responded by bringing about laws that try to solve the problems that the civil rights movement was showing. So when Martin Luther King showed that there were problems with voting rights, then Kennedy and the government of the time introduced a Voting Rights Act. In South Africa, it went the other way. Government responded with harsher and harsher terms, giving, in fact, the resistance movement more and more to resist, leading to their decision that they would need to intensify their resistance. Then in your conclusion, you sum everything up, and then you have an absolutely perfect, fairly chronological essay. So good luck. I hope it goes well.